Hey class, Dr. Zen. Well, last module or last chapter, we talk about the fun part, which is the technology. Who doesn't like technologies? That make life easier. But have you thought about under those technologies, especially if we needed to communicate from one side of information to the other side of information transmissions, or how for us to understand information, we need standards. A lot of times, those are not the fun part, but it's a necessary part. So if you took COHE, not COHE, HIMA 6060 Health Informatics, that has most of the content in this week or in this chapter have been covered in that class with one module. Or if you took the health data structure, it covered in much details in that courses as well. But again, I will just quickly go over the key points from that chapter to help you to understand why standards are important and why standards are so hard to do in healthcare and some of the common standards out there for us to use as well. All right, so learning objectives, you can certainly read through these objectives as well as the outlines. All right, so in healthcare or in any industry, we need to have standards. The reason we need to have standards, number one, we have a shared language, so everyone understands what do you talk about. Number two, the standards can be used as standards, which means that's the bar you should reach. And in most of the situation, especially in health informatics, we deal with things the former, which is how do you make sure, well, as a human being, we're so good at, our brain has been developed for so many years. We're so good at understand, of course, misunderstand as well, the, different terms, different meanings, the subtlety of languages. So, for example, example I learned from um, um, one of the presentation I was watching. So let's say the word solo, okay? Or if you're a Star Wars fan, there is a Han Solo, which is the last name of a person. And if you are a regular person or you like music, there's a solo performance, all right? Solo singer. So words can mean different things. So how do we make sure we understand the same way? Of course, as a human being, we put that into context, but it will be harder for computer to do, especially when they encounter the same words but in different meanings. So that's why we need to have standards. So before we talk about the standard process, I want you guys to understand why we want the standards. It's more than just for us, human beings. It's also for computers to understand the subtleties, the fuzziness, the different meanings of the same words, or could be the same, or could be the different words for the same meaning. If you use healthcare as example, you will know, for heart attack, you have different expression. If myocardial infarction, or sometimes the short name is just MI. So how do you differentiate that for computers to understand? So there's no misunderstanding when computer receive any information. So that's why there are activities developing standards. Basically, there are four different standards. One is called ad hoc. There's really no formal adoption process. It's basically we just get together, we find out, well, this might be the standards we're going to use. Then here it is, we'll publish. Then the other way is to let the market decide. Whoever win over the competitions will be the de facto standards. So for example, the latest one, the example with the Blu-ray, at one point there is a high definition DVD standards. It's a competition against the Blu-ray. So who owns the high definition, video standards? Of course, Blu-ray win out. So Blu-ray become the de facto standards. Then you have government mandates. Well, the HIPAA standards, that's the government mandate. Then you have a consensus. Basically, you have a volunteer. Most of them form a standards development organization and come together to reach a formal agreement. So there's many different organizations. You can read through those, and you can read through ISO. Basically, it's an international standard organization. ANSI basically is a US member of the ISO. And you have the SDO. Basically, that's a term used for any standard development organization. All right. And if we look at it, different standards, the number one standards we used a lot in healthcare is the classification standards. The reason it's used a lot in healthcare is because it's connected with reimbursement. All right. So here are a list of classification standards. The most used is the ICD standards as well as CPT codes. Many of you are probably familiar with those codes, especially if you are a provider. So ICD-9 on October 2014 migrated to ICD-10, which contains more digits for us to use, which means it can transmit more data via that. All right. So here is a CDT, that's the dental code. Here is a national drug code. Here's another representation of a classification codes. All right. So the second one will be vocabulary and terminology. What do we mean when we say something? So how do we define that? There are here several or three listed here. The most common ones, and I believe it will become a de facto standard, is SNOMED CT. All right. SNOMED CT basically is more like an encyclopedia terminology of everything you can cover in healthcare. All right. It has 100,000, hundreds of thousands of terms defined. Not only the terms are defined, but also the terms are linked. So, for example, you could say lung cancer. Well, how do you define lung cancer? Lung cancer itself certainly is a concept, but it also has an anatomical side in the lung, but it is also a cancer, which is a disease manifestation. So in SNOMED, it not only defines individual concepts, but it also defines the relationships of those concepts. Then you will probably heard about the LOINC, which basically focus on the lab value, and RxNorm, which focus a lot on drug terminology. And we talked about HITECH in previous week. So in HITECH, one initiative in HITECH, of course, the most outstanding or prominent definition or prominent legislation in HITECH is the meaningful use. But however, they also tried to encourage to build standards for information transmission. The reason being is you need to share information, right? It's defined in HITECH. So that's something you will see a lot in discussion of HITECH when we were talking about getting information flow or shared in healthcare. So that's the HITECH meaningful use. So SNOMED CT is the short name for SNOMED CT is systemized nomenclature of medicine clinical terms. So here is a history and who owns that. And currently it's owned by the International Health Terminology Standards Development Organization. And the National Library of Medicine, distribute that standards at no cost within the United States. So if you took HIMA 6060, we had a hands-on experience using the UMLS. Basically, SNOMED CT is one subset of data set or standards within that system as well. So LOINC, as I said, basically it focuses on lab data, and what LOINC does is it divide a concept into 6 different it called axes. You can think about for every concept you need 6 attributes to define that. So the number one, of course, is the code within LOINC. It's a 5-digit code. Then you will need to think about what is the component of that lab data and what's the property when measured, all right? And what's the timing and what is the system we use to measure it and what method we use and what the scale is. So here is an example. So basically it is a hepatitis B virus surface antibody. So the property measure is ANSI and the timing is the point, which is whenever the person present at a place to get measured. And the system, I believe that's a serum. Then scale is quantitative. QN stands for quantitative, and the method is, I think that's the method of that measurement. Then you have CVX standards, clinical vaccine administered. So that's the clinical standards from CDC about, how do we define vaccinations. And RxNorm basically is maintained by Library of Medicine on vaccination. Right? So here is example of each um, medication within RxNorm. So it itself has a code. It's bar delimited, and the file will look like, the drug name, unique identifier, relationships, attributes, semantic types, data history, obsolete data, 3 files, and metadata. And National Library of Medicine was trying to connect or have a repository for all the standards, but some of the standards that actually can link with each other. So for National Library of Medicine, the project they do is to have UMLS, which is Unified Medical Languages System. It just to, they understand what they try to do is to put all the language system or the standards, terminology standards together and link them. And here the subsystem within the UMS, and you had a chance to use metathesaurus in HIMA 6060. All right, so that's UMS. Data, so number one, we thought about how do we classify things. Number two, we thought about how do we define things. Number three is how do we transmit things. All right, there are several standards related to transmission. So there are HL7, that's basically deal with almost all the healthcare information transmitted within hospitals or within different healthcare organizations. Then you have DICOM, digital imaging and communication in medicine, that's for radiology. Then you have NCPDP, that's for medication. Then you also have ANSI X12N Standards. Basically, that is for business transmission. How do you transmit a data for insurance purpose? So HL7, you can read from the slides. Basically, it is the building block for all the data transmission within healthcare. All right, here's an example of HL7, and HL7 currently the most popular ones. The HL7 version 2. Version 2 is bar delimited, which basically for every field is a field between two bars, and you have a bunch of bars together, and as transmitted, it's a message. Then for HL7 version 3, it will transmit it will, transform it into an XML message. And if you remember, we talked about XML in the last video, which basically extensive markup language. So it uses tags to define different field. So make it more readable for human being. But it never fly. The reason it never flies is because it's too complicated for any organization to implement it. And the other one for any standards adoption is if you have existing standards and the standards is not broken and it's still supported by many systems, implement new standards, it may be too time consuming or resource consuming for some of the organization. So DICOM, as I said, is for digital imaging and communication in medicine. It's for radiology imaging. And NCPDP is for medications. And ASC, ASC stands for Accredited Standards Committee. Basically, they developed this X12 standards. And what it does is just to, define things related to the business transaction within healthcare. So in the book, it talks about, 5010 when we will implement ICD 10 because the field increased um, from 5 digit to 7 digits. So the problem is now you need to redefine this transmitting standards because in the past they only use 7 digit. You don't use 5 digit. Now you have a 7 digit number. You have to change how you define that standards as well. So standards are related. All right. So we talk about classification. We talk about terminology. We talk about the transmitting. Now the next big group is how do we define the content and the function of EMRs. So there are several standards here, which the book talk about them in some details. And I'm not going to talk about individual ones. And here is a typo. It should be EHR. And so number one is HL7 EHR function model. What it does is define what functions an EMR should have. So for example, here the top three relate to direct care. The next one is to support, which is clinical support, measurements, analysis, research and reports, administrative and financial, and the rest of them is just like security, health, records, information management, registry, and stuff like that. And STM, they also have a standards. They defined as for continuity of care records. Then it will basically define the structure of a medical records. Here's the same thing for CCD. It's basically it's a merge between HL7 CDA standards and the CCR standards. So you come up with the CCD standards. All right. And here, the HITECH also defines some of the things you needed to have in an EHR. So there are some, standards, several standards out there dealing with the same thing. But the trend is all those will be eventually merged with the talk between different standards. Organization just say, well, let's just have one common standards. And in the U.S., because the government intervention, especially the Office for National Coordinator for Health Information Technology, and also the HIPAA committees and the CMS, meaningful use, there's many federal things, federal initiatives can affect the adoption of different standards. So we're going to see fewer and fewer standards with the adoption by the government. Then we'll use those standards or modify those standards to accommodate with the new development in the field. All right. So eventually all those will be put together to have a nationwide health information network. So if you think about nationwide healthcare network, it's a internet on top. It's a health specific internet. So all your health information will be easily accessed on that network without, a whole lot of barriers across the organizations. So you just think about you send an email from point A to point B, how easy that is. The goal is to be able to access your information, at point A, when you maybe to see 5 different doctors, that we can use this nationwide health information network to really combine those information together to present a whole profile of the patients. So that's the ultimate goal of electronic health records, going to go beyond the barriers or boundary of individual organizations and to be able to present a full picture of the patients. So this is still under development. You go to any healthcare organization, they may share data with a couple other organizations, but if you happen to be in emergency medicine, happen to be in ED at a faraway location, I would bet that will be very difficult for an organization to access any information, even that place has an EMR system. So that there will be a lot of development in this field. That will probably need a lot of government regulations on this type of development. All right. So that's quickly about the data standards, and the book is very detailed and provides you a lot of good information. I highly suggest you guys to go over that. And of course, all these will be reinforced in 64 6480. I believe that's the course number for health data structure.